Alright, so now we're going to shift gears to the typical female reproductive system. Again, we're going to talk about the typical female reproductive system, and so you're going to hear me just talk about the female reproductive system throughout. But again, keep in mind, like all the other videos, that there are very different ways that things can change from this and still end up being considered female. Again, if you want to talk about it one-on-one, you're more than welcome to address it with me. We can talk about some of the details, but for the sake of this video, we're focusing on typical female reproductive system, and so I'm going to just kind of, rather than say typical all the time, just say the female reproductive system. And so for this, we're going to get into the female reproductive structures, including the endometrium and ovarian tubes. We'll talk about the follicular stages and maturation of a follicle, as well as the corpus luteum and the jobs they do. We'll talk about oogenesis. We'll talk about accessory glands, mammary glands, innervation for female sexual response, hormonal regulation, and then phases of the ovarian and uterine cycles and how ovulation is triggered. And then talk about what happens if fertilization and implantation occur, and talk about some of the roles of different hormones and structures with pregnancy maintenance. So let's go ahead and talk about some key anatomy. So there are some general structures that we want to get into with the female reproductive system, namely the ovaries, the uterine tubes, also called the fallopian tubes, and sometimes called the oviducts, the uterus, the vagina, the vulva, and the mammary glands. Notice that we have bunched some things together for this class, so like the structures we see all right here, from like the clitoris down here, are all going to be part of the vulva, right? All of these together produce the vulva. And so we will simplify things down a little bit just because we're not worried about individual pieces. We're going to mainly worry about physiology. So let's go ahead and talk about the anatomy of the uterus to start with, because we need to understand the anatomy of the uterus in order to fully appreciate the physiology of it. The uterus is where the embryo will implant, and this is going to have 3 layers to it. The perimetrium, or the serosa, this is the outermost layer. The myometrium, which is going to be composed of smooth muscle, and the endometrium, the inner layer, and this is going to have a couple parts to it. The stratum functionalis, this is what is shed during menstruation, and the stratum bisalis, which is permanent and is going to grow the new stratum functionalis every single month. If we look at the very base of the uterus, we have the cervix. The cervix is going to be the opening down towards the vagina via what's called the external os. This is where HPV can come into play. So this is the structure that HPV would infect. It causes changes in this. It also is responsible for most cases of cervical cancer. So if you haven't gotten your HPV vaccine, do it, because it can prevent you from developing cervical cancer later down the line. There are lots of little glands in the endocervix that are producing cervical mucus. So in that endocervical canal area, right, in the endocervix there, we're producing mucus. So what sometimes you hear it called discharge, that is normal. Some discharge is normal. It would be weird if the vagina was always dry all the time. It's not. It's kept warm and moist in one way from the mucus. The changes in the cervical mucus, though, the changes in the discharge can tell you about a person's health, though. So if the color changes, if the smell changes, if the amount changes, then that's something you'd want to consider going to a doctor and talking to them about. But the normal discharge people have on a day-to-day basis is just that, normal. This is to help support sperm. It also helps with capacitation, which is the functional maturation of sperm that only will happen in the female reproductive tract. The vagina is going to receive the sperm as part of the birth canal. It's also going to be the excretory canal for any menstruative products. So the blood and the uterine lining, as it sheds, it'll exit out the body through the vagina as well. We also have the 2 fallopian tubes, which are going to extend from the uterus to the ovary. This is where we have sperm coming into contact with an egg to fertilize the oocytes. It's also where fertilization is going to occur. So fertilization occurs in the fallopian tube. This is also why things like ectopic pregnancies can occur, because while the egg is fertilized in the oviduct, in the uterine tube, it's supposed to continue traveling to the uterus once it's fertilized, and then once it's in the uterus, implant there. However, that's not always what happens. Sometimes it does implant in the fallopian tube, in which case this is a life-threatening condition. It is a pregnancy that cannot continue because there's no way for a fallopian tube to support a developing embryo. It will break open and burst and hemorrhage if allowed to continue. There's no way to save that pregnancy. Like, you cannot take that embryo and then like shove it in the uterus. That doesn't work. We don't have an ability to do that. And so something like an ectopic pregnancy has to be treated. It has to be, and the treatment is to basically abort the fetus, abort the embryo. There's nothing we can do to save it. The only thing we can do is save the mother at that point, which is to remove the pregnancy, right, to stop the pregnancy. And then hopefully when we do that, we save her life, and we save her fertility, because if it were to be left until it was super, super life-threatening, she could lose her ovary on that side, in that oviduct, and so she would lose fertility from that side, like half of her fertility basically, right? One of her ovaries would just be gone. And so you can imagine if this happens more than once, you know, that person could become infertile if it was left untreated. When we look at the uterine tubes and what we see there, we see simple ciliated columnar epithelial cells and PEG cells. These are going to help move and nourish the developing ova. The muscularis is also going to help move the ova along as well, so that we can push the ovum along. Again, you don't want the fertilized egg. You do not want that ova to hang out in the fallopian tube. You want it to get to the uterus so that you can prevent something like an ectopic pregnancy. Some of the other glands we find in the typical female reproductive system are things like the paraurethral glands, also called the Skene's glands. These are going to produce mucus and are found in the wall of the urethra. This is what we call homologous to the prostate in males. So this is coming from the same developmental tissue that males would use to develop the prostate. The greater vestibular glands, or the Bartholin's glands, these are going to produce mucus during sexual arousal for lubrication. So this is going to help lubricate the vagina for sexual intercourse. This is going to be similar to the bulbourethral gland in males. So again, it's coming from the same developmental tissues. So if we see where they're coming from, right here is the urethra. We see the Skene's glands opening on either side. And then here is going to be the opening to the vagina, and the Bartholin's glands down here, these little openings down at the base of it. Moving on to the mammary glands, these are going to be found in the breasts, and they're going to have basically like these modified glands, these exocrine glands that are going to produce milk. And so these are going to have a couple different, they're going to be stimulated by a couple different things. So milk secreting glandular cells, these are also called alveoli cells, are going to produce the milk. They're under the control of prolactin. So prolactin, the hormone coming from the pituitary, and then the ejection and secretion of milk. This is going to be through smooth muscle and is under control of oxytocin. And oxytocin can be stimulated by the suckling, right? And so we can have this feedback loop, this kind of like positive feedback loop, where as an infant will suckle, that will trigger oxytocin to be released, which will trigger more milk to be released, which will trigger the child to suckle more, right? Because they're actually getting, they're actively getting food. And so if we see how it's kind of structured, right, we have the nipple and the areola. This is on the exterior. Leading through that nipple, right, we're going to have these lactiferous sinuses, these big openings, which are connected to these ducts. These ducts then connect to the alveoli that we have here with the milk-secreting glandular cells inside and covered by these myoepithelial cells, right? And so this is where milk is produced and then is channeled down the ducts to these lactiferous sinuses, and then again, that offspring can literally suckle that milk out through those. Getting to the ovaries are going to produce gametes, aka eggs or ova in this case. And so if we look at some key structures in the ovaries and that we have to understand, we have to know to understand what's going on here. We have the follicles. There's a couple different versions. There's primordial, primary, and secondary. These are just going to be containing oocytes at different stages of gametogenesis. We have the mature follicle, also called the Graafian follicle. This is going to be the one that releases an oocyte after ovulation. And then the corpus luteum, which is left behind, this is the empty follicle. This is going to continue to produce hormones like progesterone, estrogen, inhibin, relaxin, until it finally degenerates into what's called a corpus albicans, which is just not doing anything. It's just a little piece of scar tissue, basically, left behind. And so if we look at the stages of these cells, we go from primordial to primary to secondary to mature follicle to corpus luteum to corpus albicans. And so when we look at the formation of gametes in the ovaries, we call this oogenesis. Oogenesis is going to be kind of similar to what we talked about with meiosis, but it will be a little bit different because the primary oocytes, what we have, are going to be frozen in the beginning of meiosis 1 in prophase. So we don't even get through meiosis 1 until we go through the maturation process to secondary and mature follicle. The oogonia, which are the egg stem cells, will become germ cells. They'll divide into that, and then some of those will become primary oocytes in a primary follicle. But they're not going to do anything for a long time until we reach puberty, and then one of these a month, or some of these a month, because of FSH and LH, will develop from primordial to primary. But only a few of them will go. And only one of them will actually reach maturity, with the rare occasion where a second one does, and that gives you something like fraternal twins. But typically we see one reach maturity at a time during each monthly cycle. And so we look at the primordial follicle. Here's the oocyte. This is going to be the egg itself. But we see we have all these other supportive cells, like follicular cells, stromal cells. We have a basement membrane, we have collagen fibers, all supporting that one oocyte. Now, when we get to the mature follicle, we have now completed meiosis 1, right? So it takes all that to get through meiosis 1. And we've produced, because we got to the end of meiosis 1, we should have 2 daughter cells. However, in oogenesis, we don't produce 2 eggs. Because the egg needs all that cytoplasm. It needs everything in, like, all the good stuff. And so what we're going to do instead is we're going to have one major haploid secondary oocyte, and we're also going to have a haploid polar body. The polar body is, I like to call it the chromosomal trash can. Basically, all the chromosomes that are not going to be used in the final egg product are thrown into this polar body, which is just left behind. It does nothing. It's not going to become an egg. Then we go through ovulation. So notice, we've only gone through meiosis 1, and we're going through ovulation. The only way we will go through meiosis 2 is if sperm are present and fertilization happens. So fertilization comes before we finish meiosis 2. We do get another polar body because we are going through that meiotic process, which means more chromosomes that we don't need. So another polar body, basically another chromosomal trash can, and the ovum will become a zygote when it unites with the sperm. So the sperm hasn't fully gotten in until we get through meiosis 2 completely. But that's like, isn't that wild, right? That's kind of wild. But if you notice, we started with one oogonium, one stem cell, and we ended with one egg. That's it. We did not get the 4 daughter cells because we threw out all the extra chromosomes. And again, this is because the egg, the oocyte, needs all the cytoplasm. It needs everything to support itself and to develop into offspring. So we can't handle splitting the cytoplasm and all that apart. Rather, we're going to hog all of the cytoplasm into one cell and just throw the others away. So how do we hormonally regulate this? It's very similar on the top end. So we have gonadotropin releasing hormone coming from the hypothalamus. We have FSH and LH coming from the anterior pituitary gland. That is exactly the same as the male side. The same general process with FSH and LH, where FSH stimulates the gamete production and LH stimulates the hormone production. Major difference being in the female side, we are producing the follicles or developing the follicles in the ovary with FSH, and LH is stimulating the production of estrogens and progesterone. Estrogens are going to help promote development and maintain the female reproductive structures. It's also going to promote protein anabolism and bone density. This is one of the reasons why women can be at risk of osteoporosis after something like menopause, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Progesterone, this is going to help with the mammary glands as well as preparing and maintaining the endometrium for implantation. Relaxin, this is going to relax the pubic symphysis and dilate the uterine cervix. This is only going to be when we are preparing to give birth. So this is so that the hips can widen and the cervix can widen to allow for that fully developed baby to be born. And then inhibin does this exact same thing in here as it did in the males, where it's going to inhibit follicle stimulating hormone. So again, if we look at our picture, we see the red lines, right? And the green, the blue, orange, and red lines are all going to be, they're all going to help promote something. And then our dashed lines are going to inhibit something. And so we see like inhibin, estrogen, and progesterone will all inhibit the pituitary gland, with estrogen and progesterone also inhibiting the hypothalamus, right? So it's very similar to what we saw on the male side in terms of the hormonal regulation, just some slight differences in the names and structures. When it comes to someone who is not pregnant, we will see the following cycle. Typically, this is not perfect. The cycle usually lasts from 24 to 36 days. This can vary though from person to person. Usually we use the standard 28 days. And so that's why you think of it like a once a month thing. This is going to be the cyclical changes, namely structural and hormonal changes that happen over the course of this month. This is what's called the menstrual cycle. So sex hormones are going to help dictate it, and we are going to see two different cycles that will basically communicate with each other. The ovarian cycle, which is talking about all the things going on in the ovary, and the uterine cycle, which is everything changing in the uterus, right? And these two are going to at least respond to each other in some way. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Let's talk about the ovarian cycle first, which has 3 phases. The follicular phase, ovulation, and luteal phase. The follicular phase, which is basically the first half, right, about the first 2 weeks. Those secondary follicles in the ovary mature into a mature Graafian follicle, and the dominant follicle will secrete estrogen as luteinizing hormone increases. Then we have that big surge in luteinizing hormone, which is going to cause the Graafian follicle to rupture and release the secondary oocyte. This is what's called ovulation. So ovulation is happening in response to that luteinizing hormone surge. The luteal phase, or the post-ovulatory phase, this is what's happening in the second half, weeks 3 and 4, where estrogen and progesterone are being produced by the empty corpus luteum, which is going to help thicken the endometrium. The corpus luteum will then break down and become the corpus albicans, and so because it's broken down and it's not functioning anymore, we see a drop in progesterone and estrogens. And when progesterone and estrogens drop, we see menstruation occur. And then we go right back to the start, right back to the follicular phase, and we do this all over again every single month. When we look at the uterine cycle, we have the menstrual phase, the proliferative phase, and the secretory phase. And they follow very similar structures. So the menstrual phase is going to be about the first week. This is when the person is like menstruating, they're on their period, where the endometrial layer is shedding and breaking down and exiting out. From day 7 to 14, so week 2, we have the proliferative phase. This is where the endometrium will start to build back up again a little bit. And then the secretory phase, we see we've really ramped up that buildup from day 14 to 28, as well as a clear fluid being secreted by the endometrium. And then we go back, right, to the menstrual phase again, over and over and over again. And so if we look at everything together, so we have gonadotropin releasing hormone stimulating the anterior pituitary to release follicle stimulating and luteinizing hormone. Follicle stimulating is going to have a bigger impact in the beginning, going from primordial to primary to secondary follicles, as well as some production for the mature follicle. Luteinizing hormone is going to amp up kind of in the second week of the cycle, where we have a secondary follicle, and is going to help trigger ovulation right here. So we ovulate, the egg has been released. Luteinizing hormone will also trigger the corpus luteum to produce its own hormones. Now these follicles over here from like secondary onward are going to produce estrogens, which are going to help with the proliferative phase in building up our uterine lining. Whereas when we get to the corpus luteum and the secretory phase, we're going to be secreting that clearish fluid, but we're also going to continue building up that endometrial layer. And then at the very end, when we have our corpus albicans, we're not producing that estrogen and progesterone. We see a drop in hormones that is going to cause this endometrial layer to break down and become part of the menstruation. And so we look at what's going on throughout, right? The high levels of estrogens in the last days are part of the they're going to have a positive feedback. So all this estrogen is going to kind of kickstart and have a positive feedback on luteinizing hormone. And like we basically have this runaway train for a little bit where we get these spikes, and that's what's going to cause ovulation. So we have these spikes literally about a day or so before ovulation occurs. And so this is just the overall regulation. Again, anything in the green solid lines is going to help promote. Anything in the red dashed lines is going to be negative feedback, is going to inhibit something or slow that process down. And so we see that the hypothalamus is going to stimulate the anterior pituitary, which is going to stimulate all of these guys, right, to develop the follicle, to develop the corpus luteum. The estrogens and inhibin are going to inhibit the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary. The inhibin from the corpus luteum will inhibit the anterior pituitary. But the estrogens will also, like high levels, right, are going to promote gonadotropin luteinizing. So it depends on the level, right? If it's moderate levels, it's going to inhibit. If it's high levels of estrogen, it's going to promote. And that's so we can have ovulation occur. So when we get those high levels, it's going to kick on so that we feed back into it over and over again until we reach this point where ovulation just is forced. Low levels of progesterone and estrogen is also going to promote. So we see we're on the extremes. Estrogen is going to promote the hypothalamus and pituitary when we're on the very low end and the very high end. If we have a medium amount of estrogen, it's actually going to inhibit. So this is one thing that's a little bit different that we didn't see on the male side of things. And that's really the main thing I'm going to point out here with this slide, because a lot of it you can pause here and just kind of look through. But that's one thing I want to point out, that estrogen is going to be, it's going to promote when we're really low or really high. And when estrogen is moderate, it's going to inhibit.